Ooh, and we're live. Hello, hello. Hey, hey, hey. Hello, everyone. Joining us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We're really, really, really excited for today. I mean, we're hanging out with our literal faves, right? Like, can you just see the magic that is on the screen right now? Like, I don't know how you're feeling, Alma, but I'm going to be fangirling a lot tonight, right?
I've been fangirling all day. I was like, should I call in sick at work because I just want to get ready for this conversation? I'm super excited for what promises to be an amazing conversation on being Black and feminist in South Africa.
So tonight we'll be talking surfacing, which is on being Black and feminist in South Africa, which is edited by Desiree Lewis and Gabeba Baderoon. And we have them here tonight. And we also have, it's an anthology of essays. So we also have Zetu, Ingrid, and Grace who's joining us. And what I'll do is I'll just read, because here in South Africa, we want, at the Chikinators, we want to tell people that we're hanging out with good people, So I will start introducing our good people. While she was a PhD student in literature, Gqola Baderoon took an extramural class in writing poetry, an experience of simultaneously being a beginner and deeply practiced that she has reverberated in her life since. She has now authored 4 poetry collections: The Dream in the Next Body, The Museum of Ordinary Life, 100 Silence, and most recently, The History of Intimacy. She also writes as an academic and scholar of slavery, sexuality, Islam in a critically acclaimed book regarding Muslims from slavery to post-apartheid. She's edited several collections by women poets and is a member of the board of African Poetry Book Fund, which has published over 60 collections of poetry by writers from the continent. Baderoon co-directs the African Feminist Initiative at Pennsylvania State University, where she's an associate professor of women's, gender and sexuality studies and African studies. In addition, she's an extraordinary professor of English at Stellenbosch University, both our alma mater, Alma, and a fellow of the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Studies, STIAS. Welcome, Gqola Baderoon.
Thank you, Thank you, Alma.
And then next, we have Desiree, who is also the editor of this book. Desiree has published on politics of South African and global feminists from a Black perspective since the early 90s. Her recent work focuses on neoliberalism in relation to feminism, as well as feminism and food as material culture. The author of Living on Her Horizon, Messy Head, and the Politics of Imagining, she's guest edited special issues of feminist journalism, including Feminist Africa and Agenda, and has served on editorial boards of Australian Feminist Studies, Feminist Africa, as well as other interdisciplinary journals. Lewis began her teaching and writing career as a literary scholar, but now teaches, writes, and thinks in transdisciplinary ways that involve seeking to reanimate knowledge-making in the academy. As a feminist, academic, and intelligent activist, she's passionate about radical knowledge-making and creative expression that transcends academic and generic invention. Welcome, Desiree. I'm just like, yo, today we've leveled up.
Listen, if people are not appreciating the Chikinators today, they will never appreciate us, huh? They will never. Shall we?
Yes. Ingrid Masondo.
Yes.
Is the curator of photography and new media at the Izoko South African National Gallery in Cape Town. Her involvement with arts, culture, and heritage sector spans for more than 2 decades at a variety of institutions. She has held various positions, including archivist at the Maibuya Archives, project and curriculum manager at the Market Photo Workshop, researcher, photo editor, and member of the editorial team at Chimurenga Chronic, and curator at Bala Disha Poetry Radio. And then we also have Zetu. Zetu Matebeni is fascinated by women and their feminist energy. Perhaps this explains why she wrote and published a doctoral thesis on Black lesbians, weaving together feminism, queerness, gender identity, and space. She co-produced and co-directed the documentary film Breaking Out of the Box, Stories of Black Lesbians in South Africa. An associate professor in sociology at the University of the Western Cape, matebeni spends most of her time writing and rewriting queer theory for everyday use. Her edited books include Reclaiming Africa, Queer Perspectives on Sexual and Gender Identities, and co-edited volumes of Queer in Africa, LGBTIQI, Identity, Citizenship and Activism, and Beyond the Mountain, Queer Life in Africa's Gay Capital. Matebeni's creative work is deeply engaged with the fulfillment of young lesbians' desire to be Black, young, queer, at home and pursuing freedom. Who today we're taking you?
Hey, chicken
Leveled up. And finally, we also want to introduce Grace Musila, serves as an associate professor at the Department of African Literature at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg. Her teaching and research centers on Eastern and Southern African literatures and popular cultures. She's the editor of Wangari Maathai's Register of Freedom, author of A Death Retold in Truth and Rumor, Kenya, Britain, and Julia Ward's Murder, and co-editor of Rethinking Eastern African Intellectual Landscape. She's partial to ideas and freedom ideas afford or impede, especially in women's lives. Yeah. I mean, I think we need to just go home. We just need to go home after this.
It's done. It's done.
Y'all just need to buy the book already. You don't need to know anything but buying the book.
We actually just think that having them on the screen is sufficient. We're not going to do anything beyond this, and we can all go home. But
we'll just sit here and smile.
Pumla and I are super invested in like the essays that we read. So we're just having this conversation on many levels for ourselves, and we'll just say that we're doing it for the cheeky natives. But firstly, just to welcome our guests, we don't take it for granted that we have you on the Cheeky Natives, and we're really excited for what promises to be an amazing conversation. And I guess to start it off, I'd like to just ask our editors who are here, and we're so excited to, I guess the question really would be directed to Gqola and Desiree. And the question really relates to the choices, the editorial choices for the essays that were involved. And I guess that Tlhogonolo and I also had a conversation about some voices that we felt that we didn't necessarily get to hear in the book, and that would be those of trans women. So the conversation really is around the political and the editorial choices around the inclusion of the essays in this book.
Liz, would you like to start?
I can start very briefly by saying that the focus was very much on people who have been grappling with feminism, whether directly or indirectly, in their writing, in their artistic expression, in their teaching and writing about their teaching. And there was an effort to accommodate a range, people in different sites, but at the same time a realization that we could not be exhaustive. And the publisher, in fact, would be quite alarmed every time we said, well, just this person. So, just by way of kicking that off, but there was definitely a realization that there are limits to what a single book is able to do.
Yeah, and within that, we did aim to, and in some cases achieve, a spread of generations, and also, I think, a very important contribution to what counts as South African. You'll notice that our gathering of writers includes people from Zimbabwe, from Kenya, from Eswatini, and the contribution that this makes is not only that it reflects more accurately the state of debate around feminism in South Africa, including the most innovative perspectives, but also it contributes an idea of how to think of belonging to a nation. So aside from looking at passports, aside from looking at border controls, what actually constitutes belonging? And for us, it is participation and who really brings themselves to a space and makes it, shapes it, is present in it, not only physically and certainly not only legally. So this, I think, is an important part of what the book actually manages to achieve, even though, as Desiree points out, it can't be the last word. It really is actually a beginning.
I love that, because I think in the introduction you both say that, right? You're saying we're speaking into the void, right? There's been a lot of archival silence and we want to write against that. And I think particularly the conversation we had with Cindy Makwana just last week, she was speaking about her coming to writing, and she said, you know, when she began writing, there was this sort of like, she didn't want to be forgotten. And I feel like surfacing does a lot of that. It feels like there's a lot of neglect that has happened in the literary imagination in South Africa, right? We think particularly about Miriam Tladi, whose books are not available in South Africa, right? We think about Bessie Head's books, and we think about, like, you know, Loretta Ngobo, for instance, and we think about like how these Black women were not put in the same league as Black writers or Black male writers in South Africa. And so it's interesting. You know, the question that we had is this idea of neglect, right? And because you mentioned it in the introduction, you're saying we essentially are writing against the silence that continues to exist, right? And I wanted to know, what are your reflections about like this silence, right, that is still persisting even in the 21st century? Because we're in 2021 and this book just came out last year, and sort of this kind of the silence is still existing even in this post-apartheid South Africa. What are some of your reflections on that?
I mean, just to add to talking on this question, to the silence, there's an interesting idea that you explore in the book, and that is also the power of marginalized voices. So the idea that because people are marginalized does not render them voiceless. And I wanted to have that conversation in tandem. So to speak about the power of the marginalized voice, but also the silence you hope to write against in this book.
I think it would be great if we could all speak to that, but just to say two things briefly in response to that. One is that it's not so much the silence, because everybody, most of the contributors to the book, have been far from silent, and Black feminists have been, not been silent. But there's a sense in which they are not seen and positioned in certain ways, and I think it gets back to the point about an archival record, bringing together our voices that constitute, that we are making an intervention. And then related to that is your point, which is about speaking back. Speaking back is in this book, for all the writers in this book, is not simply a matter of testifying to my oppression. It's speaking back with voices of power that speak of long traditions of knowledge that have been erased, that define what it means to be modern beyond the kind of colonial Western-centric notion of modernity. So there's a very productive force there.
And I agree, it's a feminist project to intervene in the nature of that silence through this feminist work, because it's very much it echoes the masculinism and the racism that define the South African scene, unfortunately continuing into the post-apartheid period. In fact, what counts as Black writing has really had those same silences. So to make space as well for these voices that are innovative and necessary into what we now define as our ordinary South Africanness, our normal South Africanness, so that we don't have to have subcategories, where we claim special space. I think the absence of the voices of Black women has meant poverty in what generally counts as South African literature. So this is really a political intervention and a literary intervention as well.
I think, Ingrid, we can bring you in here, right? I think sort of the undercurrent of your piece also speaks about this type of erasure, right? Or this type of like bottlenecking that happens in photography. So what are some of your reflections about like Black womanhood, right? And being a Black woman in a space that is contested for Black women in particular?
in relation to photography. Okay, I'm going to speak all over. Do you know, it's photography is all over, and there's so many practitioners. So we can speak of, yeah, there are Black women are full-on participants in photography. But I think if you look at whose images really are trending or which artists are really successful, I think that the majority of Black women artists are really still struggling. So even if they're productive and they even seemingly visible, they don't generally have the same access to, what their work doesn't fetch the same prices, even in terms of exhibitions, publication, support, really, for Black artists, it's really hard. So there were so many things that I wanted to say. And then I went all over. But maybe speaking to some of the things that Gqola and Desiree have been talking about. When you look at the question of the archive, if you look at photographic archives, it looks like Black women have mainly been subjects and models, up until quite late in 1960s or something. But a lot of that archive is really missing. It's only around the 1980s or 90s that there's a substantial archive. So a lot of practitioners really struggle and have no reference of what people have been thinking and making and creating, and the debates going on about photography. And the other thing that I suppose I speak about, or I'm trying to speak about, is because of the proliferation of photographs, that we celebrate photography as an accessible medium, and readers are able to put in their meaning to generate their own meanings on it, as if photographs are these isolated objects, and they're not just objects, So I'm speaking about a lot of things. So I wanted to speak about this place of relations, and I think what keeps a lot of Black women creating is these relations, not so much to do with the market or the infrastructures that are actually supposed to support artists, but it's like friends, it's family, it's kin. It's not predominantly museums, universities, publishers, and so forth. And speaking back, for a lot of practitioners that don't have power, it has consequences when you speak back. There's just so much abuse and exploitation that happens. It's not just in the art market or in the creative sectors, and speaking back has consequences. So if you're just starting up, or like mid-career artist, and you're really struggling and you don't have the resources, speaking back has consequences, and it can affect whether you are able to operate. And these are the kinds of things that we tend to speak about in our little circles, in our corners. But then when you meet a abusive curator, maybe like Ingrid, then you must play nice, and you only talk on the side. And so I'm excited about photography being so accessible, but I'm also a bit disturbed and concerned that we don't tend to talk about a whole range of aspects that are part of photography and not just the photograph. In speaking largely about, yeah.
I mean, Ingrid, I wanted to speak about the conclusion, and in your conclusion, you say that the work of Black photographers, especially Black women, is seldom seen as separate from their personal histories. Is it even possible to experience their work differently, right? And I think of the insertion of Black women's politics in their work at different levels, right? Particularly as artists. And I'm curious about your reflections regarding that, what it means for Black women to always have their politics and their personal histories inserted into their artistic work.
I mean, it's really important. I mean, some of my teachers in photography, that that was the center, that you can't be going out there and making images and thinking you're revealing the world to the world when you haven't revealed yourself to yourself. It begins with you and begins with your community. So I do think that's important work. But I think it's one thing for an artist to insist that they're going to focus on themselves and on their community, and it's another altogether for readers or the community to expect that from them, and it's a bit of a catch-22. We often don't have the resources to explore freely as creatives. Like, I don't know if you remember that group of activists that we went photographing in Camps Bay. And then they were being asked around, what the hell are you doing? But all sorts of people can come into so-called Black spaces, the townships, and photographs. And we have kids happily smiling for the camera. I love a point where when kids see somebody with a camera, whether it's from their own community or not, they have the capacity to engage this person. What are you doing? For what? How? Why? And it begins with, like, it's ludicrous that in 2021 we see a camera and kids just like run and smile and nobody knows, nobody even stops, never mind the kids, but even the adults in the area surrounding, nobody goes like, hey, who are you? What are you doing? Why have you got a camera? Why are you photographing children who you didn't get permission from, who you can't get it? So to answer, yeah, in a roundabout way, there's what I started with is that I think it's one thing for an artist to decide, I'm going to focus on myself and my community, but there is this expectation from audiences and a whole range of other people that whatever we make, we don't have the freedom. It's always linked to our biography. And it is our biography, it's the center, it's the beginning of how we make sense of the world. It is really important. But there's a whole lot of impediments to freeing people who want to be creative and coming from particular backgrounds to just explore freely.
I mean, Ingrid, you mentioned something interesting, and I want to bring everyone into the conversation. One thing
everybody.
One thing I've been thinking a lot about, and I think one thing that Surface really brings to the fore, is this idea of who does the Black woman belong to? Because it seems your pieces in many ways differently speak to that, right? Like, who does the Black woman belong to? And I wanted us to just reflect a little bit on that question. Like, does the Black woman belong to anyone in this, capitalistic, patriarchal, anti-queer, anti-woman society? Who does the Black woman belong to? We can start with Zetu, and then we can move our way down.
Yeah, okay. There you decided to start with such a difficult question. No, I think in this case I will be a little open-minded, in the sense that I'll respond by saying, having participated in this project, which was really for me a joy, and I say a joy because I loved the invitation, and I've said this before. I loved the invitation, how the editors invited us and allowed us to explore and be free and have no boundaries, so to speak. And I think in the process of that project, I felt that I do share a sense of belonging because of this kind of invitation. And so, I mean, if I have to locate myself, I would say in this case, I belonged in this kind of feminist space and in this kind of feminist energy. But I could also say that, you know, in many spaces, in many ways, you know, as a Black woman, yeah, I mean, I don't think I belonged, particularly because of of many forms of denial and rejection, you know, whether it's state related, sanctioned, etc. But it was, I mean, I think, yeah, in this case, I felt a beautiful sense of belonging. And yeah, that's where I'd say.
I mean, I really like that, right? Like you in many ways are saying that we are starting to create our own community, and that is where we belong, because outside of these communities we create, we don't belong. Grace, I want to come to you on your reflection. Who does the Black woman belong to?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks, everyone, for making this possible. And big thanks to Desiree and Gqola for hosting us and making us belong together in this community with this book. So I'll do something that my students tend to do, which is to rephrase the question and then answer the new one. Just to be partly to be naughty, but because when and it's a difficult question, because when you ask who does the Black woman belong to, there's a long history of ideas about Black women belonging to two categories of men. It's either their husbands or their paternal families. So that's who they belong to. But so I'm going to rephrase that to with. Who do they belong with? And if we go with that, which I think is where Zetu has already taken us, then I think we belong firstly with ourselves, and that's part of the pursuit of freedom, is about the pursuit of just laying the foundation and the resources to enable us to fully belong to and with ourselves, and then to also get to choose the different communities and spaces and people and experiences that we would like to belong with and to contribute to and to be part of. So, but in practice, of course, we know that many Black women do not belong to or with themselves. And I think that's in the larger project of just our pursuit of freedom as Black women feminists. Somewhere in there is this desire to facilitate our belonging with and to spaces and communities and networks that just enable that fullness.
I like that so much. You know, the larger questions of like really this world that we live in. Gqola and Desiree, we will bring you in here to, you know, either rephrase the question, who do you belong with, or who do you belong to?
Okay, well, I'm not going to rephrase. I'll revert to your original question, which is where Grace was also going, I think. Because I think one reason for putting this book together, and something that's at the heart of, I think, lots of the contributions, is the extent to which there are certain expectations, stereotypes about who Black women are supposed to be, how they are supposed to write, the audiences that they're supposed to attract. And this links up with what Ingrid was talking about, which is often that the assumption that, oh, Black women are simply there to give testimony of themselves, you know, insights into their lives. And of course, that's a construct that serves a very useful purpose, because you can continue to other this woman that you have stereotypes about, this figure. So this question was at the center of the book, of contributions, where people were resisting. In a previous conversation, we spoke a lot about just the extent to which it was so important to resist the expectations about Black women's creativity. Because very often there's a market for this, but very often it's a very problematic market, because it's a market that wants to have confirmation of the stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the other part which I really loved from your question, Alma, about the communities that enable and sustain work where, I'm just came from Ingrid as well, where there is neglect in the border culture. All of us, I think, have been part of circles, as you said so beautifully, Ingrid, little circles and corners. You know, we have been part of those corners that sustained us and actually produced radical work, did radical things in the middle of the silence and the neglect and being at the margins. So, you know, I love the story that Nkosazana Xaba gathered in Our Words, Our Worlds, which is one example of the radical possibilities of women's creativity when it's not limited by outside expectations. And that the profound transformation that Black women achieved in the realm of poetry in the face of absolute exclusion, marginalization, and neglect is one example of what happens in these corners. Now, one of the contributions of the book is also to get us to reflect on the infrastructure of culture, such as who makes publishing visible, who makes photography reach its audiences, for whom is dance and fine art. That question of translation, which is the duty of all of us who are artists and intellectuals and teachers, but also, you know, what is the actual infrastructure? Who are our publishers? Where are the radio stations and the infrastructure that you two have created, for instance, in this magnificent show? So to be able to support those and to ensure that our work doesn't just get gobbled up by big, hungry multinational journal publishers, but where local African publishers are supported, small publishers even outside of universities, you know, journals like Feminist Africa, which have over 2 decades of an archive as well. These must also be nurtured, you know, and recognized so that we don't just accept the way culture is valued by voices, you know, that say publishing overseas is the ultimate achievement.
And I think that on that note, I'd like to speak to Grace's essay, right, which was particularly interesting for me. And I wanted to talk about just a few things, but importantly is the ways in which even the people in our lives can participate, even almost in an unmeaning way, right, in particular violences against us, right? So I think of the ways in which your grandfather is just perpetuating this cis heteropatriarchy without even realizing it, right? And I wanted to speak about the positioning of your grandfather as a husband, but also how that then allows for further examination of his personal politics in ways that grandfather, granddaughter directly may not allow you to do. And so I was particularly intrigued by that.
Thank you for that, Alma. And I think, and I'm glad you enjoyed it and you found some resonances there, because I think it might be a fairly familiar scenario in terms of the kinds of cross-generational dynamics that many of us, especially people of my generation, that those dynamics will probably look differently for younger people coming up behind us, simply because there's a greater shift in thinking around gender. But for many of us, those dynamics of cross-generational conversations present this awkward scenario where on one hand you're sitting with the expectations around respect, around especially respect towards elders, but also the trust that you have in the elders' knowledge of what is right for you. And I think especially for women, and Black women especially, at a certain age, we go through that moment of realizing that actually the elders might not have had it right? And it's very traumatic because there are all sorts of processes of grief that go with it. The realization that this person who you fully trusted had it wrong, then the guilt of feeling like you're betraying their memory, you're betraying what they stood for, but also we don't yet. When that happens, we don't yet have the resources to process the ambiguities of that, which is part of what I'm exploring in that story. The ambiguities of a paternal, a patriarchal figure who is keen on promoting women's education, but simultaneously also invested in this chrononormative logic of what women should do by when. So those ambiguities, it takes time before we figure out how to just digest them and what to do with them.
Okay. Zeti, I wanted to come to you because, I'm going to pick on you a lot. Just because I really resonated quite deeply with your essay. But I wanted to speak, and I think a larger conversation that we can have. But you write in your piece called Black Lesbian Feminist Thoughts of a Born Queer. You write, for days the dictionary...
You're breaking. So, you're breaking.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. So
Okay.
Just start again, because if you're going to pick on Zetsu, we need to hear you audibly.
Okay. So Zetsu writes chapter 9 of the anthology, Black Lesbian Feminist Thoughts of a Born Queer. For days, the dictionary is your friend. It would reveal your existence, each letter spelling your new name, lesbian, noun. There you see yourself, print in black on white, a homosexual woman, a woman attracted to other women. This is me, you would exclaim at the sight of yourself. The meeting would be exhilarating encounter. Finally, you've been reunited with yourself. And I think for me, this speaks about the limitation of language, but also acquiring language. I find that for many of us, even as feminists, as womanists, and as people trying to find meaning, we don't have the language, and then it feels like that moment where we actually acquire the language, we're like, oh, so I am not like this anomaly. I exist in the world. And I wanted to speak about that, right? About like how limitation of language in many instances is a form of dehumanization, but also then to speak about the idea of how acquiring language allows you to become, to see yourself and become yourself. I think often of Audre Lorde's Sammy, a new spelling of my name. So just this like entering back into yourself.
Yeah, nice. Thanks, Lekhanolo. I mean, I think you've already, you've said how beautiful it is to actually see yourself, and I think there's something about text and words that make you seem real, and find I think especially when something is written, kind of like it emphasizes the existence of whether it's yourself or the thing, because it's there, like it's almost like a tangible thing. But I think there are also other layers of finding language and finding yourself. And then in this piece, the other way that the protagonist finds herself is through what her grandmother says, and a conversation with the grandmother, and it's linked to what Grace was talking about earlier. So yes, there's one moment of finding oneself on a dictionary or what Google tells you, but there's another way of being affirmed by hearing somebody says, no, it's okay, you exist and you're cool just the way you are. And coming from a source of what you consider wisdom, even though later on you realize, that was a bit shaky. But for a moment, it kind of, it really does something to you. So I think these moments are so important in really like bringing oneself into existence. Yeah.
There is a theme, not a theme, but male fragility hovers on the periphery in a lot of these essays. I think of Grace, and the man who is intimidated by you having your PhD and him not having, his masters, and the ways in which that is almost weaponized. So this idea that you must be educated, but not overly educated, because then you become an intimidating figure. And then I think of Zetsu's piece, and I think of the threats to violence that male fragility is always capable of perpetuating, and how that always hovers in our imaginations. And I wanted some reflections from this is quite an open question, so I wanted some reflections on just that male fragility hovering on the periphery, but not always quite just peripheral, right? Because some of that is also very real, as we see in Zetsu's essay as well, in the book as well. And for me, I was just caught by these continuous examples of the ways in which male fragility threatens so much of our ability to even imagine new ways of being and imagine ourselves into different ways of existing. Not everyone at once.
No, you opened it. You opened it up, so I don't have to speak.
Will I kick off if I rephrase your question?
Please go for it.
No, it's not really rephrasing. It's just thinking about one word. So I actually thought that in many of the writings, there's a sense of the fragility of the status quo, which is heteropatriarchal. So it's often not men or male specifically, or embodied in men as such, but it's and it's related to language and the way in which very often central figures, or that there's a description of the struggle against this thing that is sometimes amorphous, but it's really quite complex. And what I really appreciated about a lot of the writing is the struggle with this complexity, rather than this obvious monster called patriarchy. So, there's this, it's often, for example, in Jackie Job's work, it's kind of conveyed through women figures who become sort of custodians. So, yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, and I also sorry, did you want to
No, I'm waiting for everybody else. I want to hear.
Yeah, I think that is a wonderful insight, because of the depth of the writing as form is also something that really is remarkable about this book. And as Desiree points out, that depth, that lyricism, that beauty, that power is doing important work, because it is dealing with a phenomenon. I can't even call it a category, but a phenomenon that masks itself as the way things are, and the way we've inherited it, and it's authentic. And to take on that task is, at once you have to go very deeply inside yourself, as Grace and Zeta were saying, to be able to confront what has often been comforting and what has been an inheritance in some ways. But then you recognize the constrictions of it, how it presses your body, and it presses your imagination. So part of the exquisite artistry of these pieces of writing is doing that work of confronting that amorphous thing, and at least outlining it, showing its existence and showing its limitations, and also showing its fragility. How, sometimes if you push against one part of it, you reveal the tear in it. And from that opening, can come the new imaginings, the new forms of existence, as you so beautifully put it, actually, Alma. The reason we keep grappling with your questions is that we're just thinking, yeah, that was beautiful. It was really nice. So just before, why we're teasing you.
Any thoughts, Ingrid and Grace? Yes, Grace?
Sorry, I just wanted to really just agree with how Desiree and Gqola are framing this notion of the fragility of the status quo, because in a way, many of the systems that we exploring in the essay, in the different essays in the book, masquerade as very solid and very powerful and very on top of their stories. But actually, they need that masquerade precisely because they are fictions. And that's the same with heteropatriarchy. It needs it's a big fiction that really needs to continuously invest in convincing us of its power and of its naturalness and of its full control over the entire spectrum of our conduct and our behavior. And that's why then it lashes out very strongly whenever there's a potential threat to the status quo, exactly as Desiree was saying, because if it was genuinely as solid and as clear about its position as it pretends to be, then it wouldn't be too bothered about a whole lot of things that it's bothered with. And I think that's something that's shared in different variations, obviously, but it's shared with other sort of oppressive systems or systems of that perpetuate forms of prejudice and oppression. They really, at their core, they are very aware of their fictiveness. And they really need to protect that hollowness. And that protection then entails a very massive and elaborate and sophisticated machinery of performing control, performing power, performing and taking every threat, even whether real or imagined, very, very seriously. So I think that's part of the thread. I'm just, I really like how you're framing it. And that's great.
Ingrid and Zetsu, any thoughts?
I suddenly feel like I'm in a master class.
I know. You are. Yeah.
And I mean, just starting this because this question that Alma is raising, and as I'm hearing Gqola, Des, and Grace talk, and I'm thinking, sometimes, I mean, you were saying something about language and words, and I'm like, sometimes I think the term male fragility just doesn't really capture what is going on. And I liked what Grace was talking about, the fiction of it and the hollowness. And I'm like, these are the words that need to go with this thing. And because fragility, as Gqola was describing it, like you're pushing against something, and then even that action that you did, for me it was like, oh my God, yeah, I can actually see the fragility, but I don't see it as I see it as how you're putting it. But what Alma is asking is not this. It's the other thing that we need to talk about, and which doesn't feel like fragility, So that's why I'm saying I'm in the masterclass, because now it's like a lot of like new concepts that need to emerge. So I'm thinking, and I'm loving it.
Yeah. I am in a masterclass. And I was thinking about the issue of language too, and thinking what's going on is not fragility. But I was thinking about the written language and how I struggle with it, and how I can use fragility to describe myself in engaging with that. I find other forms so much more easier. It's like and what was it that I think it was Zetsu that said in the conversation about a language, how it can facilitate finding yourself. And for me, it's not really so much in words. It is in images, unfortunately, but it's also in smell is huge in my life. So it's so I was thinking about language also in that way, and like beyond the written word, what ways have brought me to myself? What are the modes that have brought me to myself? And like movement and dance is also another. well, in dance, there's something. I'm now going back to fragility. It's like this form that I'm so attracted to, and I absolutely love. But there's something really, I don't know if fragile is the word. I wasn't answering your question directly, Alma, but I was like, yeah, no, fragility, and somehow, and I'm not discounting your question and statement, where I do think we need to. It is a broader question, but I'm fascinated by how we spend so much time. There's so much time spent lately on male fragility, or it's phrased in that way, you know. So there is something quite disturbing about that. It's way bigger than fragility, and I think being in a space of women and strong women, feminists, then there's this push back against talking about our own fragilities. Now we must spend time talking about male fragility, and as if we can't be all of it, you know, at the same time. I'm not saying that's what you were saying. I'm just responding to so many things that happened.
I love what you're saying, Ingrid, because in many ways it also points to the limitations of language, right? And the ways in which language may not be sufficient to convey sometimes what are such vast ideas and vast questions. And I guess, Ingrid, further to your points is to speak to art speaking in the place of words, because as you said, there's this major focus on language, and we've become aware of the limitations of the ways in which language may not always contain what it needs to, but there's an important place for art to speak. And I guess that's just really what you've also just highlighted in what you said, that in many ways art can speak in place of words and speak as powerfully, if not more powerfully.
I've been thinking a lot while reading Surfacing about Beautiful Experiments and Wayward Lives by Saidiya Hartman, and just like this idea of being wayward, right? And like just like how I think Surfacing in many ways is like these beautiful experiments of just Black women gathering effectively and just, you know, dovetailing off each other because of this, as Etu said, in community with, right? So this community. And I've been thinking a lot about your conversation, Desiree, with Zoe, which was absolutely a stunning conversation to read. I hope it's recorded somewhere so we can like archive it and just, it's just stunning. But one thing that I've been thinking about Wayward Lives is, you know, Saidiya writes and she says, you know, I wanted to write about these women as if our lives mattered. And in the place of where the archive was limiting, I began to imagine. And I think a lot of what Surfacing is doing in Being Black and Feminist is this idea of an imagination, right? What does it look for us to begin to imagine ourselves as feminists outside of, let's call it the male gaze, the patriarchy? Because then we begin to decenter phallic understandings of words and stuff like that, right? So what does it mean for us to imagine this community? And I wanted to speak about that, right? What does it mean for you as feminists? And what is the role of imagination in your own feminist practice?
I think because you link that to the conversation, I'm trying to join the dots, but I think it's a much more expansive set of questions and comments that, for me, the imagination is hugely important, and I think for all the contributors in this book. You know, I think that there was just a refusal to kind of adopt narrow polemical styles and kind of, you know, develop a straightforward point about racial violence or patriarchal violence, but more to tease out and disentangle what power means. And if this is what power looks like, what is beyond that? So the book is divided into subsections, and, you know, the first section is supposed to be sort of like positioning. And then towards the end is supposed to be kind of reimagining, but that's in many ways very artificial. And as the introduction points out, everybody is looking forward at the same time that they are sort of dealing with what is. The way it's connected to the conversation, which is, I think, what you were also leading me to, I'm not quite sure. But one point of the conversation was to focus on the fact that there are very important contestations and conversations that Black feminists are having about the role of representation, about the meaning of icons like Sarah Baartman, about the meanings of people like Winnie Mandela. And I think so often there's an assumption that Black women constitute this group that's thinking in a sort of singular way about everything. And that, of course, is not the case. To say that would not to do justice to a vast body of critical thought. So, let me stop there. You might want to circle back to it, but I think that I'm out. That's it for me now around that question. Thanks.
Thank you, Desiree, because I think Letochnon and I earlier on were speaking about meaning making, right? Which in many ways is itself also quite a political act, especially for Black feminists. And so for me, I mean, we just, as we begin to wrap up this conversation, but also to think about the work of surfacing, I'm really interested in what meaning making looks like now and what it means now for you as having contributed to surfacing, because I'm really interested in just the politics, and I think I'll leave it there, and feel free to rephrase, because Letochnon and I had quite a tussle back and forth just about meaning making and the ways in which we construe meaning, right? And the politics of that as well.
Maybe I can just say, before other people pick it up, that meaning making is also just so contingent on occupying a particular place, not simply on one's shared racialized and gendered identity, but what the meaning making is about. So, for example, at UCT, the feminists were confronting a very particular dynamic. So it was important for them to invest certain meanings in certain ways of thinking about Sarah Baartman. Just one comment about that.
Yeah, I'm going to combine your two questions of the power of the imagination and the political power of making meaning, and think about the way the book ends with this look toward the future, and to think about things like agriculture and economics and climate change, and all that is defined as urgent for humanity, but definitely nothing to do with what women's imaginations do or what women's practices do, especially women in Africa. And I think what both Yvette Abrams and Patricia McFadden do by inviting us into their spaces and into the work of their hands, which is directly connected to the work of their imaginations and also their scholarship. And this is translated in the most resonant and beautiful and evocative way into saying, this is how humanity can redefine its relationship to our practices with one another, our building of community with one another. Inside of our bodies, what is our relationship with our with food, with growing it, with imagining a future in which our own survival is not pitted against the survival of the planet, and to say that not in a functional way, but in a way that creates a new imagining of a community, feeling a community with a planet, feeling a community with your neighbor who, like you, is stressed by the operations of the state, but you may be middle class and she may be working class poor. So what do all of these possibilities hold if you practice a visionary imagination, if you dream a new future? And so for me, part of what is very beautiful and important about this book is that we encounter the dreams of these feminists. And in doing so, we make new possibilities, new meanings of a future that arise out of experience, out of this ground. So that is my response to the two of you.
Ingrid, do you have any reflections on imagination and meaning making?
Des and Gqola put it so well. But I'm going to go back to photography, since that is what I was talking about. You know how photography or photographs are often talked about, like, oh, photographs say 1,000 words, and, you know, as if we can make meaning in an isolated way. And, you know, referring back to partly what Des was saying, that, you know, we come from certain positions and we classed and we gendered, and we bring all of that to it. And also what I was trying to point to is that it's a continuous, ongoing, productive process, photography. You know, it doesn't just begin with making the photograph. How does the camera and a photographer and something, how does that move to an object, a print? There's a whole lot of people that are involved, that have particular agendas, particular politics, and how we end up seeing what is a printed photograph or framed in whatever, that those spaces act on the photograph. So all of that is part of meaning making. And so I think I would just like us to all pay more attention to making some of the processes visible, because I think that enables the reader to have more information, to be able to read the photographs better. So if we're not giving any information, as we're presenting these beautiful images by themselves, and you come as a reader and you just make whatever, but you haven't been given all of this information. So of course the meaning you make is going to be lacking. So to just think and imagine a different kind of way of photography, or different notions of photography. How can these relations be different, of the people we photographed, of publishers, or curators and photographers, or photographers and viewers or readers? In a nutshell, I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Grace.
Accountability. Can I say one last thing? Yeah, I think, who in this infrastructure of care and accountability, who is the photographer accountable to? Who's the editor and the publisher accountable to? And so, we need to hold each other responsible for what we do and what we make and how we make. Otherwise, technology is just like zooming, and there's more and more equipment and devices, and we can all make this stuff, but we're not talking about it. I just wonder sometimes, there's so much photographs being made. When do we have the time to stop and think and question and?
And I think, in a way, the question around the imagination and waywardness, whether I love the idea of this book as a gathering of wayward women, I think, so that's how it's fired in my head. But in a way, those questions, I think, tie back to the forms of disciplining, and in all the different senses of the word, that each of the contributors comes from, and just the kinds of freedoms that Gqola and Desiree gave us to literally just explore and take it in whichever direction we want to take it. And for me as an academic used to a different kind of set of rules and protocols, it was just both exhilarating but also scary, because now you're having to venture outside your usual language. But I think when you think about it a bit more, in a way, part of the work of feminist imagination, which is also part of why a lot of feminist work tends to be haunted by this idea of, oh, it must be autobiographical, precisely as you're saying earlier, Ingrid, which is something that comes up a lot in literary work as well. And that behind that idea that women can only produce autobiographical work is, of course, an anxiety about, good Lord, we do not want to think about the possibility of women venturing into their imagination, because who knows what will come out of that. So we won't even acknowledge that this is the work of imagination, because to acknowledge that is to acknowledge these huge possibilities that are thrown open by the imagination, including the forms of languaging that Zetu was speaking about, that again, the book throws open to include different languages, not just textual languages, but also dance, art, visual languages, body movements, etc. So for me, it's impossible to talk about feminist life and work without talking about imagination. But I think the bigger question around, and tying back to your question, Alma, around meaning making, is to say, and that's a challenge I think for me personally, is how do we strike that balance in terms of how we spend our imagination between fighting, pushing back against those systems you're talking about, Ingrid, and imagining new and more joyful, not necessarily new sometimes, but just surfacing more joyful, more affirming, more of the possible. Because, and that's always the danger. The danger is our history is marked by so much of our energy going into the fight, and so little of our energy going into, okay, so now, supposing all these monsters were out of the way, what could we do with ourselves? And a lot of the time we don't know what we would do with ourselves, because we're so absorbed in fighting other people and fighting all these systems, as we must, because we need to survive. But yeah, I would be interested to know just more about, how do we spare a little more energy for the possible?
Yeah. Hey, Grace. Oh, hi. Hey, Grace always drops the mic. I know you. Yeah, I know you. You make the pots. You do everything. Look, I'm just so excited. I'm just so excited to be part of this book, and I'm excited to be, firstly, to, as I said, to be invited to just be free. And I say that embodying all the different categories that I embody. And I think my interest is really it piggybacks to the question that you started with, Alma, for all kinds of women and all kinds of feminists to imagine themselves in this book. And I say that specifically because queer women, queer people, and especially trans women have been excluded from many feminist conversations. And I think part of what this book does, yes, it may not have a self-identifying trans woman who has written, but there are many opportunities for us to imagine ourselves and to imagine the world the world we are creating anew, or in as Grace says, in many joyful ways. And I think that there's definitely scope for that. And of course, I'm pretty sure that, as Desiree and Gqola said, this is the opening or the beginning of the conversation. So, surfacing 2 or another term could come up, and there'll be more other different or all different voices of women and feminists. And what I liked is that, feminism is not closed. Yo, guys, yeah, it's we are just liberating ourselves in many different ways, and it's just so beautiful.
Thank you so much, Zetu. I think this has been an absolutely amazing gathering. I mean, I personally want to continue talking, but I know people have lives to live. But thank you really for what has been a really fruitful and wonderful conversation of surfacing. And thank you really, I think like this conversation also surfaced a lot, right, around language, meaning making, and just words, right? So thank you very much. And to everyone who's watching, and if you've enjoyed I mean, no, not if you've enjoyed this conversation, because you've enjoyed this conversation. You are going to head over to the Cheeky Natives. You can email us at info@cheekynatives.co.za in order to get your copy. We've got copies available at the Cheeky Merchant of Surfacing. So you can just pop us an email and say, hey, I also want to be part of the feminist joy. And I also want to be part of the feminist gathering. So please make me part of it. I think in true from the Cheeky Natives, like this book really is a beginning. It opens up so much conversations. I think we've only focused on a few essays, but there is so much more that Surfacing gives us, right? Please get it so you can get the full extent of like Surfacing and all the wonderful work. But thank you, Gqola. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Desiree. Thank you, Zetu. Thank you, Grace, for what has really been an absolutely wonderful, wonderful conversation. I kind of feel like we should start like a lecture series as the Cheeky Natives, and just like Surfacing must be our starting point, right? We just bring into like a master class on this. Wow, we were just in class today.
We were in class, we were taken to church, we were taken, listen, they're absolute levels to this, but really from the Cheeky Natives is to thank every single one of you for your time. We don't take it lightly. We are so grateful for so much of the learnings that this conversation has opened up to us, right? And of course to everybody who's watching at home. And we know that this is really, we just scratched the surface of what Surfacing has to offer. And so we hope that this will spark so many more conversations on what is such an important book and really is so much important writing. And there's just something about seeing your experiences on paper that makes you feel a little bit less alone in this world. And so thank you to every single one of you. This has been awesome. Please, can everybody go out and get the book? I think that the way really to continually fight against the silencing is to support the work of Black writers. And so we implore you to please get Surfacing and get Surfacing for a friend and a friend and a friend, because this is mandatory reading.
Thank you.
Again, thank you everyone
for having us. Thank you.
And everyone who's watched, we really are grateful that you've watched. As you can see, there's a lot of great feedback. People are like, thank you for a wonderful discussion. Thank you for hosting this fabulous discussion. And we're glad that like our Cheeky Natives at home also enjoyed and learned as much as we do. But to each one of you, thank you for the work that you do. And more importantly, thank you for choosing to stay here. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.